Hi there and welcome to my channel. My name is Emma and I make weekly videos on art, upcycling, and DIYs, so if that interests you, make sure you subscribe. In this video, I'll be showing you how I made 3 different types of paper flowers. I'm relatively new to making paper flowers, but I do think it's a great beginner's craft. They are a bit time consuming, but if you're willing to put in that time, they can come out incredibly realistic and so pretty. I tried to make a large, modern floral centerpiece and I love how it turned out. I'll link all of the materials I use below. Now let's get into the video. The key to these flowers is this crepe paper kit by Leah Griffith. It is amazing. There are a bunch of different colors that these kits come in, but I was drawn to this set. It's surprisingly durable and it's really stretchy, but you can get any colors you want in this. You'll also need some super sharp scissors. I've done paper flowers before without them and I greatly missed it. I'm going to start by taking some scrap paper and sketching out the shape of my flower. This one was supposed to be kind of a tulip shape, and I'm making 2 kind of fat almond shapes that are going to be 2 different sizes. The smaller ones will be my inner petals and the larger ones will be my outer petals. I then laid out some light yellow crepe paper and I'm measuring it to the length of my petal, and I'm cutting a bunch of strips of this. I love making these flowers because you can make a bunch at once. I'm going to stack these strips on top of each other. You can do as many as you want. I'm just making 1 flower for now, so I did 2. You'll also want to cut them to the height of your template, and I was able to cut my paper into 3 sections. Make sure they're nicely stacked, especially if you're prone to dropping them like me. I want to make sure there are no weird edges on there, so I'm restacking them perfectly. You'll then lay your template on top and take your very, very sharp scissors and cut it out. To give the shape some extra dimension, I'm taking my scissors and cutting them back and forth to create ridges along the top of the petal. Now these are definitely fine as is, but what I love about this crepe paper is that you can add watercolor to it to give it a lot of extra dimension. So I laid them out and grabbed my watercolor palette and took this bright orange and lightly tapped it along the outside ridge of the petals. I also took a little bit of that paint and did a line down the middle. I'll eventually blend this out, but I want to start with it along all of my edges. Once all of the edges were painted, I dipped my brush back in water and began to blend everything out. I know it may feel like the paper's getting more fragile, which it is to some extent, but I promise you it can handle this amount of water. I haven't had any rips unless I was messing with it too much. You can be patient and let it air dry, or you can be like me and grab a hairdryer and dry it manually. This paper is super stretchy and satisfying, so once you have the finished petal, you can pull on the edges and it creates a little cup shape, which is perfect for a tulip. I repeated all of those steps, the cutting and the painting, for the smaller petals as well, and began lightly pulling my petals apart to create these cup shapes. Now, this next step isn't completely necessary because you can't totally see the center of the flower, but I want to show you different techniques to create different centers of different types of flowers. So I took some of my yellow paper and cut out a Y shape. I then began using my fingers to twist it and create little tiny nubbins. I twisted it and then I folded it back because I want to create 3 little lines. After you're done twisting, it should kind of look like this, and then you'll grab some floral wire, and that's what we're going to be using for all of our flowers. It creates such a wonderful stem. Start by adding some hot glue, and then we're going to add our little tiny center of the flower, whatever it's called, in the middle. You'll then go a few inches down on your stem and add some hot glue so the middle part is kind of higher, closer to the top. You only need a tiny bit of hot glue, and be careful you're not burning yourself during this step. You're putting your hands very close to it and the paper is very, very thin. I made sure the darker part of the petals was on the outside so you could see it nice and visibly, and just began adding them petal by petal. What's nice is you can always rearrange these and move them around. This paper is super flexible. By the end of it, I flipped my flower upside down and was adding the petals upside down because it was a little bit easier. And of course, you can adjust them as needed, pull them, scrunch them, re-glue as much as you need to, but the end result is gorgeous. We need the stem to be a little bit thicker to be more realistic, so you're going to need some floral tape and you'll add hot glue right to the top of it and start wrapping your tape around that floral wire, and this is going to make it a little bit thicker. Now, this technique does not necessarily come easily at first. I've only done this like 4 or 5 times, but you can tell I'm doing really fast, so it'll take a second to get the hang of it, but once you do, it is very smooth sailing. Once you get to the end, you'll want to cut off the excess and use a little bit more hot glue to glue the end securely on. I felt like the top could be a little bit thicker, so I took a tiny section of floral tape and added it to the top so it kind of tapered, with the top being a little bit thicker than the rest of the stem. The final result is a super gorgeous and realistic flower. The leaves that I made are super duper simple. I just folded some green paper in half and cut it out in a really elongated almond-like shape. It's going to be pointy on both ends and then a little bit thicker in the middle. I then grabbed some floral wire and put glue directly on the wire and placed that in the middle of one of the leaves and smoothed down that middle ridge. I also added some glue to the edges and my leaf is complete. I emphasized the middle a little bit more, and then you can bend it and style it however you want because the wire is in the middle. Next, we're going to be making some daisies / chamomile. This was actually supposed to be chamomile, but they turned out a little bit bigger. So of course, I'm going to start with my white and cut some of it out. And for this, I folded it into tiny sections, accordion style, that I'm going to be using to make a million petals, because this will require quite a few petals if you're going to make some bunches of daisies / chamomile. I cut off the edges so none of them stuck together, and then I was ready to cut up my petals. For these, because they were so small, I didn't make a template because I felt like it would be kind of hard to hold on to, so I just cut this a little elongated teardrop shape. This was kind of tricky because so many layers, and if I were to do it again, I probably would have done less layers. I used a little bucket to store them in because these are so light that if you breathe or sneeze or cough, they will absolutely go flying. I did this process over and over again until I had used up all of my paper, and you can always go back and make more after you're done and you realize you don't have enough. I then grabbed some yellow crepe paper for the middles. I'm going to ball up a tiny piece of it, and then I'm going to cover that piece with another piece of yellow because the balled up piece is kind of wrinkly and gross, but I want my yellow to be a little bit brighter. So I took some watercolor and added a little bit of that yellow to a section of my paper. I used my hairdryer to speed up the drying process, and then I cut out my little piece and wrapped it around the ball I had made before. I cut off the excess because we don't need that much, and then I threw a little bit of hot glue right in the middle of that to attach everything together. I wanted to add a little bit of green around the very edges of it as well, so I did that with my watercolor after I had formed the ball. I brought back my petals and added some hot glue along the base of my center and began very carefully putting on the petals. You don't want to get burned. I started off with one layer at first, and then I just kind of looked at it, saw if I liked it, and began to add more as I went. So no, you can always layer it up later. You may need to add multiple layers of hot glue as well while you're doing this process. The petals looked a little too perfect, so I kind of smushed them between my fingers to roll them up and make them a little bit smaller and imperfect as they would be in nature. And I did unroll them as well, but the smushing really did help. I then added a second layer of petals because I felt like it was still a little bit too sparse, And here is the finished daisy. It turned out so cute. I glued the finished tops of my daisies on some floral wire, and I did some full pieces of wire, and then I also did some short pieces of wire because I'm going to make them attached. There'll be multiple flowers coming out of one stem, and I'll show you how I do that in a second. I got my floral tape and began adding it along the top of my flower and wrapping it around, as I've done with all of my flowers, but this time, again, I'm doing some shorter, and then I'm going to wait to do my longer ones because I'm going to intertwine the shorter ones with the longer ones. Now that I've got 2 short ones ready, I'm going to start doing my long one. I'm going to do it part of the way down, and then I'm going to grab my shorter one, put it in a placement that I want so it's a little bit lower than the one above it, and wrap the floral wire around it. I'm going to do that with my second one as well. So they're all at different heights and they're attached by the floral wire, and I will finish it off, like all of them, with some hot glue on the end. And then of course you can adjust them to face all the same direction or different directions, different heights. You can do singles, doubles, or something like this, which is a set of 3. I started off by making my template. This flower has a really wide petal, so I made sure it was nice and wide at the top. And then I began to cut out my pink crepe paper in sections that were the same width as my template. I ended up cutting 3 pieces. I then cut those pieces into smaller sections. That was the height of my template. I ended up with 3 of those as well. Of course, I threw my template on top and cut it out very carefully. And once I was done, I added some ridges to the top by moving my scissors back and forth to create a wavy pattern to make it a bit more interesting and more realistic. I then grabbed my watercolors and began putting this really nice rusty color on the top of all of them and in the middles. It's important that eventually it's blended in, so I began by putting it on all of the tops and the middles, and then I followed it with a bit of water on each, really pushing my brush around to make sure all of the edges are soft and blended in. I set them aside to dry, and while they were drying, I made the middle of my flower, which is going to be a little ball of some sort. I took a spare piece of paper and rolled it in a ball and set that aside, and then I'm going to be covering it with some brown paper, which I don't have, so I took some watercolor and painted a small piece of this green paper brown. It is super satisfying to watch it dry with your hair dryer if you have one, because it shrinks and shrivels up. I then cut off a small piece of that to wrap around the ball that I made earlier, and that's going to be the very center of my flower. I cut off the excess, and then I added some glue right around the edges of it and pushed it together to make sure it all stayed. I cut a small strip of my brown and folded it in half, and now I'm going to be cutting a bunch of teeny tiny lines that are going to go around the ball that I made earlier, and you want to get these as thin as possible. I wrapped them around my ball to see how long I needed it and trimmed off the excess. I threw some hot glue around it and glued my frayed edges on. They seemed a little bit long, so I did end up trimming them just a little bit after looking at them, but you can leave them that length, do whatever you want. Next, I glued the center onto a piece of floral wire and brought my petals back and began gluing them on. Unfortunately, my camera stopped filming after 2 petals, but you get the gist. Once they were glued, I pushed them around, moved them around, and scrunched them to make them a little bit better. This is a very loosey-goosey flower, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I grabbed some floral tape and began twirling it around my stem after gluing the top to make it a little bit thicker. And then, of course, once I got to the end, I cut it off and added a tiny bit of hot glue to close off the arrangement itself. I glued some floral foam onto an old bowl and kind of covered it with moss. I probably should have done a little bit better of a job. I made sure that all of the flowers were different heights and that it looked really pretty from the front. If I wanted to make it pretty from all sides, I would make more flowers to go in the back, but I love how it looks from the front. All of them are so different, and all of them together just make such a beautiful arrangement. What I love about making paper flowers is that once you get the idea of how to make them, you can try a bunch of different colors, shapes, and techniques. I would describe making paper flowers as easy, but time-consuming. I hope this video was helpful, and let me know if you want to see more videos like this in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and happy making!